The aim of today's session is to give people a background on a human rights-based approach which underpins all of CMU's work and will be fundamental to those applying for a Community Innovation Fund grant. People who experience stigma and discrimination related to mental health are being denied their human rights. So it's important that we raise awareness that people have human rights in relation to accessing health, accessing work, accessing employment. By using a human rights-based approach, we can help people understand what rights they have and devise rights of redress for people in Scotland who experience mental health related to stigma and discrimination.
In essence, a human rights-based approach is about putting human rights considerations at the centre of all policies and practices. It's about really grounding things in human rights. Internationally, the UN system has adopted a common understanding of what a human rights-based approach is, and it focuses on these three core pillars. So the first one is about empowerment of people whose rights are affected to know about their rights and to claim them. The second one that I suppose is the other side of that coin is the ability of people who make decisions that affect human rights to make decisions that are based on human rights and to understand what they're doing. And this has to be backed up by a system of accountability for times when human rights are not met. Underlying this is a set of core principles which is summed up in the panel approach. The first of those is participation, which is about everyone having the right to participate in decisions which affect their human rights. This might include issues of accessibility, providing information in a way that people can understand so that they're actually able to participate, and also making sure that they have an opportunity to participate in a meaningful way in the way that things are developed. The A stands for accountability, and this is the accountability of those who make decisions that affect people's rights to rights holders, people whose rights are affected. And this requires both effective monitoring of human rights standards and effective remedies when human rights standards are not met. The N is for non-discrimination and equality. So this focuses on the need to eliminate discrimination, but also the need to prioritise those who are in the most marginalised situations and face the biggest barriers to accessing their human rights. And I think that's one that's particularly relevant for the stigma and discrimination work that we're talking about today. So in taking this principle into account, you might want to ask, does the activity that you're talking about identify who's most vulnerable, most marginalised and excluded? Does it pay particular attention to the needs of vulnerable groups, such as perhaps women, minorities, disabled people? The E is for empowerment, which I've already mentioned, and that's empowerment of rights holders. So in order for a human rights-based approach to be effective, everyone really needs to know what their rights are, what they're entitled to expect, and be supported to participate in decision-making that affects their rights, and also maybe to take steps to claim their rights when they need to do that if they're not being met. And this is all tied back to legality, which is the L of panel, which is about recognising that the situations that we're talking about are underpinned by legally enforceable human rights. So human rights law comes from a number of sources. There are a number of international treaties at the UN level which cover a broad range of rights, and some of them focus on particular groups, like disabled people, women, children. In Europe, we have the European Convention on Human Rights, which probably is what you're most familiar with, and that's the human rights law of Europe. And domestically, the European Convention is legally enforceable in the UK in a way that the international treaties are not. These are some of the rights that are protected by the Human Rights Act. So the Human Rights Act puts the European Convention directly into our legal system, which means that you can rely on the rights that are in the European Convention. And it contains some of the rights that you're probably most familiar with. So there is, for example, Article 2, which is about the right to life. There's the right to a fair hearing, the right to freedom of expression. The rights here they sort of fall under certain categories. And firstly, we have what are called absolute rights. And this means that these are rights that can't be interfered with in any circumstances. So you have an absolute right to life. You have an absolute right to freedom from inhuman or degrading treatment. And there's two aspects to this. There's a sort of negative aspect, which means that that shouldn't be interfered with in the sense that someone shouldn't take your life. The state can't kill you. and should refrain from subjecting you to inhuman or degrading treatment. And that might be situations like the unjustified use of force or restraint, refusing to provide medical treatment that should be available, which would alleviate suffering. And then there's also a more active aspect to this. They're called positive duties, and it means that sometimes there's a need for the state to step in to actively do something to protect your rights. So protecting your right to life might include protecting against risks to life like suicide. So if, say you're in hospital and the nursing staff knew or ought to have known that there was going to be a real risk of suicide, then there's an obligation to take all steps to avoid that from happening. The next sort of category of rights is what's called limited rights. And this means that there are some rights that can be restricted, but only in specific circumstances. And the right to liberty is a key one of these. And it can be restricted for certain specific reasons. So if you have committed a crime, your right to liberty can be restricted. If you require treatment for mental illness, that's another specific reason that can permit your right to liberty to be restricted. The European Convention then has another type of rights which are very interesting and a little bit more complex, in the sense that they require a balancing act to be carried out. And these are called qualified rights, which means that they can be restricted if it's justified. The one that's probably of most relevance and the one that's proved to be the most sort of dynamic under the European Convention is the right to private and family life. And that's actually got quite a wide scope. It's sort of expanded over time to take in lots of different things, but the central concept in it is that people are entitled to dignity and autonomy in their own lives. It has to meet these certain criteria if your rights are going to be restricted. So there has to be a law underlying it, which is about the idea that it's foreseeable. You know when your right can be restricted. You know that it's possible that it can happen, and there are safeguards against it happening at random, essentially. It must be for a legitimate aim, and those aims are set out in the Convention, but they include things like the economic well-being of the country, and that means that there's scope for decisions to be made on the basis of resources to an extent. Also includes aims like protection of health. The restriction of your rights must be necessary, it must be proportionate, and it must not be discriminatory. So the question for us is, what do we need to do to assure and not assume that the good intentions that start at the top actually translate into good practice at the bottom? And this led to the development of what's called Scotland's National Action Plan for Human Rights, which has the acronym SNAP, which is a roadmap for the realisation of rights in all areas of life in Scotland. So under SNAP, we have a number of action groups that focus on different areas. We have one focusing on creating a better human rights culture, which is working towards those three pillars that I identified at the start about empowerment, ability and accountability. And it's looking at building on good practice and trying to make that the norm. We have action groups focusing on better lives, and this focuses on particular issues that came out of our research that were identified as priorities that we need to tackle in Scotland. One of those was around health and social care, one's around justice and safety, and one's around an adequate standard of living, poverty issues. There's then an action group focusing on a better world, which is looking at our place internationally and trying to place us at the forefront of good practice in the world.